The static between voices. The radio crackled with static in the pre-dawn darkness of the Vosges mountains, its broken transmissions barely audible over the distant rumble of German artillery echoing through the snow-laden pines. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy pressed the handset closer to his ear, his breath forming small clouds in the January cold as he tried again to reach battalion headquarters. The 3rd Infantry Division had been holding these frozen ridgelines for 3 weeks, and Murphy's voice had grown hoarse from shouting orders across the white expanse where sound seemed to die in the heavy snow. "Baker 6, this is Charlie 2-7. Do you copy?" The words came out cracked and strained, drawing skeptical glances from the exhausted soldiers huddled around the damaged radio in their makeshift command post inside an abandoned stone barn. Corporal Jenkins shifted his feet to restore feeling in his frozen toes and muttered to Private Collins, "Kid's voice is shot. Can't even get through to command. How's he supposed to call for fire support if the Krauts come up that ridge?" The other men nodded grimly, their faith in their young sergeant wavering as his attempts to establish contact continued to fail. Outside, the German forces had been probing their positions along the mountain approaches for hours, testing the American defenses with small patrols that appeared and vanished like ghosts among the dark fir trees. Everyone in the barn knew a full assault was coming with the sunrise. Intelligence reports had warned of German armor and infantry massing in the valley below, preparing to punch through the 3rd Infantry Division's thinly held line. Murphy's platoon had been assigned to hold this particular crossroads, where 2 mountain paths converged, a position that seemed insignificant on the maps, but controlled access to the entire sector's supply routes. What should have been a routine overnight posting had turned into a nightmare when German forces launched a surprise counterattack 3 days earlier, cutting off their retreat and isolating their small force in the mountains. 22 men had started the mission. Now only 14 remained, crowded into the stone barn, with dwindling ammunition and no reliable communication with higher command. The radio had taken shrapnel during the first German probe, its damaged circuits producing only intermittent static and garbled voices from distant units fighting their own battles across the Vosges ridgelines. "Baker 6, Charlie 2-7, urgent traffic," Murphy tried again, his voice barely above a whisper now. The men around him exchanged worried looks in the dim light filtering through the barn's broken windows. Sergeant Davis, the oldest man in the unit at 28, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should consider pulling back without orders, Murph. That radio ain't working, and your voice is going fast." Murphy's hands trembled slightly from the cold as he adjusted the frequency dial, searching through bands of static for any sign of friendly contact. His throat felt raw from 3 days of combat in the frigid mountain air, each transmission becoming more difficult as his vocal cords strained against the damage. The men around him had begun discussing their options in hushed tones, some suggesting they abandon the position before the next German attack overwhelmed their small force. The stone barn that sheltered them had once housed livestock, but now served as their final strongpoint, its thick walls providing some protection from the mortars that fell sporadically throughout the night. Ice had formed on the inside walls where their breath condensed, and the men huddled together for warmth while maintaining their watch positions at the windows and doorway. Then, through the static, Murphy heard something that made his blood run cold despite the January freeze. Faint German voices, speaking in their native language but close enough that the radio was picking up their field communications. His damaged voice had somehow helped him tune into the enemy frequency, and what he heard made him grab Private Kowalski's arm urgently. "They're talking about hitting us from the north," Murphy whispered, his cracked voice suddenly irrelevant as intelligence poured through the damaged radio. 3 companies, moving through that pine grove behind the ridge." The German voices continued, discussing timing and coordination for what sounded like a major assault, designed to crush the American position completely before reinforcements could arrive in the Vosges sector. How long could they hold against overwhelming odds when their only lifeline to command had become their window into enemy plans? If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The platoon gathered around the radio as Murphy translated what he could understand, his damaged voice now their most valuable asset rather than their greatest weakness. The Germans were planning a dawn assault from the direction everyone had assumed was secure, counting on the Americans expecting an attack from the south where previous probes had tested their defenses. "Son of a bitch," Jenkins breathed, his earlier skepticism evaporating as Murphy relayed the enemy's tactical discussion. "They're going to come right through that gap in our line where we pulled Kowalski's squad back yesterday." Murphy's mind raced as he processed the intelligence flowing through the static. The 3rd Infantry Division's positions in the Vosges had been stretched thin for weeks, with each unit responsible for more ground than doctrine recommended. His 14 men were supposed to cover nearly a mile of mountain terrain, an impossible task under normal circumstances that had become a death trap with this new information. The stone barn that had seemed like a trap suddenly became an advantage if they could reposition before the attack. Murphy studied the faces around him, seeing the mixture of fear and determination that had become familiar over their months of fighting through France. These weren't the same green troops who had landed at Anzio. They were veterans now, hardened by battles across multiple campaigns, but still young men a long way from home. "Davis, take half the men and set up positions in those rocks above the northern approach." Murphy's voice cracked with each command, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Jenkins, you and the rest come with me to that fallen tree line by the stream. We'll catch them in a crossfire when they come through." Private Collins looked at the bulky radio equipment that had become their window into German plans. "What about this thing, Sarge? Can't carry it if we're moving to contact." "I'm staying with it," Murphy replied, his throat burning with each word. "If I can keep monitoring their frequency, I can warn you about changes in their plan. Coordinate our response." It was a dangerous choice, remaining exposed in the barn while his men took defensive positions, but the tactical intelligence was too valuable to abandon. The decision drew protests from several soldiers who understood the implications. Staying with the radio meant Murphy would be isolated, unable to withdraw quickly if the German assault overran the position. But without communication, the scattered American forces would be fighting blind against a coordinated enemy attack. As his men gathered their equipment and prepared to move into the frozen darkness, Murphy remained crouched beside the radio, adjusting the frequency to maintain clear reception of the German transmissions. The static seemed to pulse with his heartbeat as he listened to enemy commanders finalizing their assault plans, their voices growing more frequent and urgent as dawn approached over the Vosges ridgelines. Corporal Jenkins paused at the barn door, looking back at his young sergeant hunched over the radio in the pale light. Something in Murphy's posture, the way he held his shoulders, the careful attention he paid to each German transmission, reminded Jenkins of a hunter listening for game in the Texas woods Murphy had described during their long marches through France. "Murph," Jenkins called softly. "You sure about this? Staying here alone when they hit us?" Murphy looked up from the radio, his eyes reflecting the weight of command that seemed too heavy for his slight frame. "Got to be done," he said simply. "Can't coordinate the defense if I can't hear what they're planning." The German voices on the radio grew more animated, discussing final preparations and timing sequences. Murphy translated fragments for his men, enemy units moving into assault positions, artillery support coordinates, and the chilling efficiency of a well-planned attack about to unfold against their undermanned positions. Outside the stone barn, the Vosges mountains lay silent under their blanket of snow, but Murphy knew that silence was deceptive. Somewhere in the darkness, 3 companies of German infantry were moving through the pine forests, following paths that would bring them within striking distance of the crossroads his small force was meant to defend. The radio crackled again, and Murphy leaned closer to catch every word of the enemy transmissions that would determine whether his men lived to see another day in these frozen mountains. Dawn broke slowly over the Vosges Mountains, the pale January light filtering through snow-heavy clouds that promised more winter weather. Murphy remained alone in the stone barn, surrounded by the detritus of hasty evacuation. Empty ration cans, discarded equipment, and the makeshift bedrolls his men had abandoned when they moved to their fighting positions in the darkness. The German radio traffic had intensified as their assault units completed their approach march through the mountain forests. Murphy's damaged voice barely functioned now, reduced to painful whispers, but his hearing remained sharp enough to track the enemy's tactical communications as they coordinated their final preparations. Erste Kompanie in Stellung came through the static, followed by confirmations from other units taking their assault positions. Murphy's limited German was sufficient to understand the tactical significance. The enemy was nearly ready to attack, with overwhelming force concentrated against his scattered defenders. Through the barn's broken windows, he could see the positions where his men waited in the snow-covered rocks and fallen timber. The crossfire plan was sound in theory, but 14 soldiers couldn't cover all the approaches to this vital intersection. Too much ground, too few rifles, and an enemy that knew exactly where they were. Private Kowalski's voice crackled through their own radio net, barely audible from his position overlooking the northern approach. "Movement in the tree line, Sarge. Looks like a full company, maybe more." Murphy keyed his handset, his whispered response almost inaudible. "Copy. Wait for my signal." He knew the German commanders could hear American transmissions just as easily as he monitored theirs, so communication had to be minimal and carefully timed. The weight of the situation pressed down on him as he listened to both radio frequencies. His own men reporting enemy movement and the Germans coordinating their assault with professional efficiency. The 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting through these mountains for weeks, losing good soldiers to hold every ridge and valley, and now his small unit represented the last line of defense for this crucial supply route. Sergeant Davis came through on the radio from his position in the rocks above. "Got eyes on at least 2 companies moving up the draw. They're using those game trails we marked on yesterday's patrol." His voice carried the steady calm of an experienced NCO, but Murphy could hear the underlying tension of a man who understood they were heavily outnumbered. The German transmissions revealed the scope of their tactical problem. Coordinated artillery fire would precede the infantry assault, followed by a 3-pronged attack designed to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers. Murphy's throat constricted as he realized his small force was facing regimental strength opposition. In the distance, the first German artillery rounds began falling, their explosions echoing through the Vosges valleys as enemy forward observers adjusted fire onto suspected American positions. The stone walls of the barn shook with each impact, and Murphy instinctively hunched closer to the radio as shrapnel rattled against the building's exterior. Jenkins's voice cut through the static from his position near the stream. "They're starting the prep fires, Murph. How much time we got?" Murphy monitored the German frequency for artillery coordination signals, translating their fire control procedures in real time. "Maybe 10 minutes before they lift fires and start the assault," he whispered into his handset. "Remember, let them get close before you open up. Make every shot count." The radio in his hands felt heavier than it should, weighted with the responsibility of coordinating a defense that seemed impossible on paper. 14 American soldiers against 3 German companies, with no prospect of reinforcement and limited ammunition for a prolonged engagement. Yet Murphy had learned during months of fighting across France that battles were won and lost by small actions, individual decisions made under pressure that somehow accumulated into larger victories or defeats. The German artillery shifted its pattern, walking the explosions closer to the crossroads, where Murphy waited alone with his radio. Each impact sent tremors through the stone barn, and he found himself unconsciously timing the intervals between rounds, calculating how long he could maintain radio contact before the position became untenable. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The German artillery lifted with military precision, leaving an ominous silence that Murphy knew would last only seconds before the infantry assault began. Through his damaged radio, enemy commanders coordinated the advance with professional efficiency, their voices calm and methodical as they launched 3 companies against his 14 men scattered through the Vosges snow. Angriff beginnt jetzt came through the static, followed immediately by the sound of boots crunching through snow and the distinctive crack of German rifles opening the engagement. Murphy watched from the stone barn as muzzle flashes began winking through the pine trees, his men returning fire from their concealed positions among the rocks and fallen timber. The battle unfolded exactly as Murphy had overheard during his long night monitoring enemy transmissions. German soldiers emerged from the northern pine grove in assault formation, expecting to find sleeping Americans in defensible positions. Instead, they walked into carefully coordinated defensive fire from soldiers who knew exactly when and where they were coming. Murphy's hoarse voice carried across the frozen landscape as he directed his men's response to each phase of the assault he could hear being coordinated over the German radio. "Second squad, they're trying to flank left through that ravine. Davis, shift your fire to cover the approach by the big pine." The engagement quickly developed into the kind of close-quarters mountain fighting that favored defenders who knew the terrain. Jenkins and his team poured accurate fire into the advancing Germans from their position near the stream, while Davis's squad controlled the high ground among the rocks, creating intersecting fields of fire that channeled the enemy advance into predetermined killing zones. But numbers began to tell as the German assault gained momentum. Murphy could hear his men calling for more ammunition, their rate of fire slowing as they conserved rounds for the most critical targets. The radio crackled with urgent requests for support that he couldn't provide. His force was already committed, with no reserves to plug gaps in their thin defensive line. "Murph, they're getting close to overrunning Jenkins's position," Davis reported, his voice tight with strain. "Need to do something fast, or we're going to lose the whole left flank." Through the German radio frequency, Murphy heard enemy commanders ordering their reserve company forward to exploit the breakthrough they sensed developing. 3 more platoons of fresh troops preparing to assault positions already under severe pressure from the initial attack. His small force couldn't absorb that kind of additional pressure and maintain their defensive coherence. The stone barn shook as German mortars began targeting his position, having identified the radio transmissions as a command post worth destroying. Murphy hugged the floor as fragments rattled through the broken windows, but kept the handset pressed to his ear, monitoring both friendly and enemy communications as the battle reached its critical phase. In that moment, listening to his men fighting for their lives while German reinforcements prepared to overwhelm their positions, Murphy made the decision that would haunt him for decades. Rising from his sheltered position in the barn, he gathered his rifle and the remaining ammunition he could carry, leaving the radio set to continue monitoring the German frequency. "All positions. This is Murphy," he whispered into his handset one final time. "I'm moving to reinforce the left flank. Continue present fires and watch for my signal." He stepped out of the stone barn into the hell of small arms fire and exploding mortars, moving toward the sound of heaviest fighting where Jenkins's squad was being pressed back by superior numbers. The radio he left behind continued crackling with German transmissions, but Murphy could no longer hear them over the roar of combat that surrounded him as he advanced through the snow toward the enemy assault. His damaged voice, which had failed to reach friendly headquarters for 3 days, had somehow guided his men through the most dangerous fight of their lives. Now, as he moved toward the point of greatest danger with his rifle ready, Murphy understood that some battles couldn't be won by coordination and tactical intelligence alone. The weight of what Murphy carried into that snowy crossfire wasn't visible in any after-action report. Years later, when the citation was read aloud at ceremonies, the words would describe tactical excellence and inspiring leadership under fire. But they couldn't capture the specific moment when a 19-year-old sergeant from Texas realized that all his careful planning and radio intelligence meant nothing if he watched his men die from a safe distance. Moving through the snow toward Jenkins's embattled position, Murphy felt the familiar emptiness that preceded his most dangerous actions. Not courage, but a kind of mechanical efficiency that shut out everything except the immediate tactical problem. The German voices he'd monitored all night had become individual soldiers firing at his friends, and the radio that had given him such valuable intelligence was now irrelevant compared to the rifle in his hands. Jenkins saw him coming and shouted over the gunfire, "Murph, what the hell you doing? Supposed to stay with that radio?" But Murphy was already sliding into the shallow depression where the corporal's squad had taken cover, assessing their ammunition situation and the German positions that were pressing closer through the pine trees. "Radio's done its job," Murphy replied, his damaged voice barely audible above the combat noise. "Now we finish this the old way." He could see the tactical situation more clearly from this forward position. German infantry advancing in rushes, using cover and fire discipline that marked them as experienced troops rather than the green replacements his unit sometimes faced. The secret that would never appear in any official record was how Murphy felt during those next minutes. Not the calm determination described in citations, but something closer to terror, transformed into forward motion, the same mechanism that had carried him through previous battles when rational thought would have counseled withdrawal or surrender. Private Collins, who survived the war and tried for 50 years to explain what he witnessed that day, would always stumble over the words when describing how Murphy moved among the German positions. Not the superhuman heroics of legend, but something more unsettling. A young man who had learned to function efficiently while absolutely terrified, turning his fear into a kind of tactical precision that seemed impossible under such circumstances. The German company commander, monitoring his own radio frequency, later reported engaging significant American reinforcements at the crossroads. He had no way of knowing that the devastating accurate fire disrupting his assault came primarily from a single soldier moving between positions, using the tactical intelligence gathered during the night to predict and counter each phase of the enemy advance. Murphy worked his way through the snow from one fighting position to another, coordinating his men's fire and engaging targets that threatened to break their defensive line. His throat was too damaged for shouting commands, so he directed the defense through hand signals and his own example, appearing wherever the pressure was greatest and somehow maintaining cohesion among forces that should have been overwhelmed. The cost of those actions wouldn't appear in casualty reports. Murphy paid for each forward movement with something that couldn't be counted or treated by medics, a piece of the young man who had grown up hunting in Texas woods, who had laughed with his squadmates during their advance through France, who had once believed that surviving a battle meant returning to the same person who entered it. When the German assault finally broke and enemy forces withdrew through the Vosges forests, Murphy found himself alone among the empty positions his men had defended. The radio in the stone barn was silent now, both frequencies gone quiet as the tactical situation stabilized. His voice was completely gone, reduced to painful whispers, but the crossroads remained in American hands. Sergeant Davis approached through the snow, carrying the casualty report that would accompany Murphy's eventual decoration. 2 men wounded, none killed. Statistics that seemed miraculous considering the odds they had faced. But Davis could see something in Murphy's eyes that suggested victory had cost more than the numbers indicated. Something that wouldn't heal with rest and hot food. The young sergeant, who had monitored enemy radio transmissions all night, who had coordinated a defense against impossible odds, was disappearing into the legend that others would create from his actions. What remained was a different person entirely, someone who had learned that heroes were just ordinary men who continued functioning after the part of themselves that felt safe in the world had been permanently destroyed. Captain Morrison arrived with the relief column 3 hours after the German withdrawal, accompanied by field medics and the paperwork that would transform Murphy's desperate stand into official recognition. The young sergeant sat quietly beside the radio that had started everything, his voice completely gone, but his eyes reflecting the hollow satisfaction of men who had held ground they were never supposed to keep. "The men tell me you monitored German radio traffic all night, then coordinated our defense from forward positions under direct fire," Morrison said, consulting his notes while medics treated wounded soldiers. "Sounds like textbook small unit leadership under impossible circumstances." Murphy nodded silently, his throat too damaged for conversation, but something in his expression suggested that textbook didn't capture what had actually transpired in the snow among the pine trees. The radio beside him crackled with routine traffic now, supply requests, personnel reports, and the administrative routine that resumed after battles ended and the paperwork began. Private Collins watched the captain writing his preliminary report, translating their desperate fight into the clean military language that would eventually become Murphy's citation. Phrases like inspiring leadership and tactical excellence seemed inadequate to describe what he had witnessed, not superhuman heroics, but something more complex and troubling. A young man's transformation into an instrument of war that cut away pieces of himself with each use. The stone barn that had sheltered their radio position showed scars from the German mortar fire, its walls pocked with fragment holes that let January wind whistle through the spaces where Murphy had crouched all night, listening to enemy voices plan the destruction of his small command. Davis secured their equipment, while Jenkins compiled the ammunition expenditure report that would puzzle higher headquarters. How 14 men had held against 3 companies with so few rounds fired. "Radio intercept gave us the tactical advantage," Murphy whispered when Morrison asked for his account of the action. "Knew where they were coming, when they were coming, just had to be in the right place at the right time." His explanation omitted the cost of being in those places, the specific moments when tactical necessity had required him to become someone he wouldn't recognize in peacetime. Weeks later, when the 3rd Infantry Division continued its advance through the Vosges Mountains, Murphy's action would be written up as a model example of communications, intelligence, and small unit tactics. The report would note how monitoring enemy radio frequencies had provided crucial battlefield information, enabling a vastly outnumbered American force to achieve tactical success against superior numbers. But the report couldn't capture what Murphy carried with him as his voice slowly returned and the division moved on to new battles. In quiet moments between engagements, he would unconsciously reach for radio handsets, listening to the static that connected friendly units across the front lines. Sometimes, in that white noise between frequencies, he could still hear German voices planning attacks that were already over. Tactical discussions from a battle that existed now only in his memory and the official records. The citation that eventually accompanied his decoration would describe conspicuous gallantry and inspiring leadership, language that transformed his desperate coordination of an impossible defense into something clean and heroic for public consumption. But Murphy knew the weight of what those words concealed. The specific fear that had driven him from the radio to the forward fighting positions, the tactical calculations that had required him to risk everything to save his men. Years after the war, when civilians asked Murphy about his decorations, he would often deflect their questions with self-deprecating humor or change the subject entirely. The radio that had saved his unit in the Vosges became a symbol he couldn't explain to people who hadn't spent a winter night listening to enemy voices plan their destruction, then walking forward through snow and gunfire to stop them. The static between enemy transmissions had taught him something that no training manual covered: how ordinary men became legends, not through fearless heroism, but by continuing to function effectively while everything that felt safe about the world was systematically destroyed. The young sergeant who had grown up hunting in Texas was gone, replaced by someone who would spend the rest of his life carrying memories that were too heavy to share and too important to forget. In the end, Murphy understood that the legend others built around his actions was just a story people needed to tell themselves about courage and heroism. The truth was simpler and more troubling. He had done what seemed necessary at the time, and the cost of those decisions would echo through frequencies only he could hear for the rest of his life. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.